Hussein here. So we're going to go through SQL Server Management Studio. So in part one, we configured and connected to it. So this is part two. What we'll do is we will create, alter, and drop databases using SQL Server Management Studio. So we should already know how to connect to it. If you don't know how to do that, watch part one of the SQL Server tutorial series. So if we go to connect, database engine, and then we have everything configured. So server name should be the local, Windows authentication, and we should connect. This is the Object Explorer window that we should see once we're connected. And the very first thing that we can do is we can create a database using the GUI. GUI stands for Graphical User Interface. It's nothing more than saying this SQL Server Management Studio. It's a well-known technical term. GUI basically means the application that we're using. Or we can write a query to be able to create a window, drop a window, or alter it. So when it comes to databases, we can either write a query or we can use the actual SQL Server Management Studio to achieve the objective that we want to do. So if we click on databases, if we expand that, we currently don't have any user-defined databases. We haven't actually created a database. So we've only just got the system ones. And we don't really need to touch those. So if we right-click, we're going to go through the GUI first. So if we click New Database, under database name, we just choose a name. So if I was to say HUS, DB standing for database, and just say database 1, and all we need to do is just click OK. Once we've done that, you see very quickly under databases, we have a new database. So HUS DB1 is the database that I've just created. Okay. And I can also write, so in new query, so if we do Control N or click on this button, we have that new query window. I can also do a query. So if I was to create something, we just use create. And then what do we want to create? We want to create database. And then again, what I'll do, I'll call it HUS DB2 in this instance, because I want to create a second database just to show you the difference between creating it through the GUI or through a query here. So if I click execute, it says the command was completed successfully. Oh, but we can't really see it here. What do we need to do? We have a refresh button. So this refresh button refreshes the server. So if we click here on this arrow that's pointing, we should refresh that. And then if we expand databases again, we should see the second database that we've created, which is here. So first one, we created it through the GUI. How did we do that? We pressed new database, and then we obviously gave it a name. And then the second time, HUS DB2, we created it through the query. So this actually happens if we wanted to create a table, it's the same instance. If we wanted to create a view, it's the same instance. So anything that we want to create, we start with create, yeah, which is a definition language. DDL, will come onto that in subsequent lessons down the line. But just the most important bit to understand is there's always two ways to be able to do something in SQL Server, either through the GUI or we can write a query to achieve the same thing. Now, once we've created these databases, there are two files that get created every single time that we have a new database. So how do we find that? If we go to properties, if we basically right click to any of those databases, if we go to properties, and then under properties, we go to files. So I'll expand that window here. The most important section here is where it says paths. So under paths, this is the actual path where the files are going to be stored. We get two particular file extensions. So we have HUS DB1, which is the first database that I created. And then the extension here is really interesting. We've got .mdf. .mdf is actually where the data is going to be stored. So if we ever populate our databases with actual data and tables and columns and so on, this is where it's going to be stored. The second file extension that always gets created with a new database is HUS DB1, which is the name of the database, and then log, yeah, which is a log file. And then that file extension is .ldf. Why do we need a log? Now, that's a transaction log. So whenever there's an update, delete, if we've ever done anything within the database to change something, altered something, that's called a log. Everything gets logged behind the scenes. We don't need to pay attention to that. The only time it really comes into play and is crucial is if we've made an error or if we deleted something by accident, we can roll back that change if we've got the logs. Okay, so that's the main difference. The .mdf is to store the data, and then the LDF is to store the logs if we ever want to roll back any of the changes. So we go back to here. The second thing is we want to talk about is if we ever want to just rename the database. Maybe I'm just not happy with host db1. Again, same principle applies. We can do it through the GUI. We right click, same way as you would rename a file. If you've got a file locally, you'd go right click and then rename, and then I can call it host rename 1, and then just press enter, and then that is renamed now. And then we should see the database itself renamed. Okay, so we've done that through the graphical interface. So now let's try and do renaming of the database using SQL. So if we alter, right, because we want to change something, database, we want to alter database. What do we want to do? We want to find host db1, db2. Let's just rename db2 and modify. And then what do we want to modify it to? So let's just say we want to call it host db33. Okay, and then now if we run that, the database name hostdb has been set, but we haven't seen that in the Object Explorer. Again, if we go back to the earlier on, we had to refresh the server. So if we click on that and then we refresh and then expand the database again, we should see now the other db2 that we renamed now. So here we renamed db2 to host db33. So the first one, host rename 1, which was the first database that we created, we've renamed it using the graphical interface. And then this, we've done the renaming of the database using a SQL query. And that's it. So when it comes to working with databases, that's how we can create them. We see where the files are stored and so on. Now, if we want to drop one of these databases, how do we do that? We can then just go, right, drop database. And what database do we want to drop? Let's drop this one. See here, rather than me typing it out, I can just drag it. I'll drag it to here. And if I press execute, it says command completed successfully. Again, if we want to see that that's actually worked, we refresh the server, expand the database, and that database is no longer there. We've dropped this database. What happens if we want to try and drop a database that we're already connected to? So we are connected to that. So at the moment here, we are connected to master. This is our current context. How do we know that? If we hover over the top of the query window, we can see it says SQL Server 02.master because we're connected to the master database. If I change this and context switch, so if we go to the top here, click on that arrow that's pointing down so we can switch between a context. What do we mean by context? We have several different databases, right? So if we had a multitude, if we had 20, 30, 5 different databases, it doesn't matter the number, all of them will appear here. So that's context switching. We can switch between different databases. So at the moment, we was connecting to the master database, which is obviously, as we go back to previous videos, our system databases. We don't really need to touch those or interrogate those right now, but just know that they just come with the SQL Server that we download. Nothing to do with what we're trying to do at the moment. So we've only just got one database connected. If I click on this database, that means I'm connected to this database now. If I try to drop and create the same, drop database statement, and then I say, okay, well, I want to drop this one, but again, we're connected to it. How are we going to drop it? We get an error message. What's the error message? Cannot drop database username 1 because it is currently in use. Now, in part 1, when I talked about there could be a multitude of developers, developer 1, developer 2, developer 3 or 4, or however many people that are in a particular working group or a team can connect to the same SQL Server and work on a single database. This is where it gets really, really important to understand. I can't drop a database that one of my colleagues is actually using. If we wanted to do that, we can do that through the graphical interface and disable or kill any of their connections, and it will enable them to roll back some of their changes that they've done, which is stuff that we'll come on to at later videos. But what we can do is here, if I try to drop something that I'm connected to or another developer is connected to, I get an error message. How do we get rid of this? So now if I was to switch, right, context switching, if I switch to a master database, I'm connected to a different database, right? If I go hover over the top here, I'm connected to SQL Server 02.master. Now I can drop this, but I can also drop it in another way. So if I right click using the graphical interface and I say delete, we can have an option here where it says close existing connections. So if your colleague is working with this particular database, you can drop their connection. I mean, you can kill or close the existing connection that they have to that database, and then we'll be able to delete it. Okay, so that's the very important bit to understand. If we want to drop it, if we want to alter it, we've already altered the name, but if we want to drop it, just make sure that you're not connected to it or another developer is not connected to it. And if they are, make sure that it's okay for you to then kill their connection and be able to drop it. Otherwise, you're going to stop somebody else from working. So I hope you've understood the 3 things that we've gone through, which is creating a database, we've altered the name, we've deleted the database itself, and we've enabled and understood how the context switching works between if we're connected to a database, we can't really drop it. And if we do create a database itself, 2 files are created. One is MDF, which is where the data is stored, and then another file, which is a file extension of LDF, which is where the transaction logs files are stored if we ever want to recover a change that we've done or a mistake that we've done. So I hope that's been useful, and I'll see you on the next subsequent lessons.